welcome to the Tabletop Games blog topic discussion.
Deck building, a modern card mechanism. Card games date back to the 1400s with Carnival, or Thuringian Carnival, often listed as the oldest one, at least the oldest in Europe that we know of. As a popular trick-taking game in Germany for centuries, it clearly started a trend. Many trick-taking games are still popular in Germany today, and I certainly grew up with a fair few. However, card games have come a long way since then. In this article, I want to look at deck building games specifically, and how this mechanism has been applied in many different ways since Dominion made it popular. I probably don't need to explain it, but deck building is a mechanism where players select cards in some way to add to the hand, discard pile or draw deck. The aim is to make their overall collection of cards more likely to let the player win the game. Sometimes players start with a random set of cards or maybe a pre-built deck that they then change during the game. As far as I know, deck building games didn't originally allow for cards to be removed. The idea of thinning your deck to make it more efficient by removing less useful cards was introduced later on. Mind you, the German trick-taking game Skat does have a similar concept. After dealing everyone the hand, 2 cards are placed in the middle, face down. The winner of the subsequent bidding phase then takes those 2 cards and may use one or both to replace them with cards from the hand. It's not quite thinning, but it's close. Anyway, the idea of trashing your cards during a deck building game is now a relatively common facet of this mechanism. In fact, it's often a key element that players should take advantage of. Deck building games are usually designed in such a way that players start with less powerful cards. Adding better cards does make the deck better, but the less powerful ones still slow things down. So shedding these cards during the game makes players' decks more powerful overall. Deck building games are used to simulate some sort of combat, usually between only 2 players. The decks of cards would consist of attack cards, healing cards and money cards. As you would expect, attack cards reduce an opponent's health, healing cards allow you to increase your own health, and money cards are used to buy better cards, often from a publicly visible and shared offer row. Players would play cards out in front of them and use them appropriately, then discard them all. They would redraw their hand from the draw deck, and then, when that ran out, they would shuffle their discard pile into a new draw deck. Of course, games started to introduce other types of cards to create some variety and renewed interest. For example, magic or energy that you could use to cast spells introduced a new type of resource you needed to manage. Ultimately though, everything was about inflicting damage on your opponent, protecting yourself from attack with shields to reduce the damage, healing yourself, or buying new cards. Shards of Infinity introduced the concept of being able to play some cards immediately after buying them, but then having to take them out of the game. I think that's quite clever, because it means you can gain an effect straight away, while not adding to your deck and therefore keeping it nice and thin. Mystic Vale changed the building element in such a way that your deck would never get bigger, but instead the cards would get more powerful. You're basically buying upgrades to your cards rather than adding to your deck with cards. Also, rather than attacking your opponents, Mystic Vale is a race game where you want to get the biggest share of a pool of points. It didn't take long for the mechanism to be applied in very different ways than what I've talked about so far. I guess one of my most popular ways of using deck building is in the Undaunted series of games. When I started to play Undaunted Normandy with a friend, I was expecting a war game where your cards represented commands to move pieces around the map and attack your opponent. However, I didn't expect the game to be so much of a deck building game in the classic sense. Other than having to learn the actions on offer, the game felt immediately familiar. You draw cards, play cards, draw up again, shuffle discards into draw decks and everything else. Alright, instead of a shared offer row, you have your own supply of cards. Instead of having money cards, you have the bolster action. Cards are also multifunctional, allowing you to choose one action of 3 or 4 from each card. However, everything else is very much like a classic deck building game. At the same time, you're playing a war game on a map with cardboard tokens and dice. It's unexpected but works absolutely beautifully. Fort is definitely a deck building game, but it changes where players can buy cards from. There's a shared offer row, but any cards a player didn't use on their turn are also available for others to buy. The idea is that cards are children that you have invited over to your place. The cards that you play represent the kids you decide to play with. The cards you didn't play are those that you ignored and didn't include in the group. They hang around in your yard, waiting for a nicer kid to invite them over and play with them. The latest deck building game I've played is Imperium Classics. I think this game takes the mechanism to another level. Every player takes on the role of a faction, such as the Romans or Vikings, represented by a unique deck of cards. Every faction has different powers and plays in a different way, making the game asymmetric. While most factions want to become empires and score the most points, for some factions their best strategy is different. They want to end the game early by forcing the other players to take the most unrest cards. There's still a shared market of cards and players can play cards in front of them like you will have seen in other deck building games. There's also the usual drawing up to your hand size, discarding cards and shuffling your discard into a new draw deck. However, there are lots of little extra twists and changes that create so much extra interest. Even though you're not replaying history, the essence of the faction you're playing does come through. It's obviously highly abstracted and probably quite stereotyped. Vikings want to pillage, Romans want to build monuments, etc. Yet it is amazing how much depth there is to this game. It's basically just a few decks of cards and some cardboard tokens. I haven't yet written my review of Imperium Classics, but let me say this. After playing it twice, my friend bought Imperium Legends because he liked what he saw so very much. So watch the space, as I say. I'm sure there are many other deck building games that introduce new concepts and push the mechanism in different directions. Are there any deck building games that you enjoyed playing? What did you like about them? What new twists and new takes on this now classic mechanism have you come across? As always, please share your thoughts and experiences on the blog at tabletopgamesblog.com. I wonder what great deck building games I might have missed.
Thank you for listening to this Tabletop Games blog topic discussion podcast. Please check the description below for links mentioned in this episode, as well as to the written version of this article on the blog. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give us some stars or leave a review. Please also tell your friends about me, and if you want to offer financial support, check out my Patreon and Ko-fi pages, links to which you'll find in the blog at tabletopgamesblog.com. So thank you again for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.
This podcast was made possible by the generous help of my supporters. Royal Patron Sean Newman, Magic Champion John Risley, Castle Guards David Miller and James Naylor, Dice Masters Alex Bardi, Paul Grogan and Robin Kay, and Shining Lights Jacob Davis, Gavin Jones, Sarah Reed and Richard Simpson.